All right, so I think I'm actually kicking us off here on the first couple of slides. Again, my name is Lisa Nowinski, and I'm so glad to be here today. Go ahead and move to the next slide. Excellent. So in our first transition session back in the fall, we talked about a number of really important elements of healthcare transition. And today we're going to dive into some ways that we can prepare early for other aspects of transition. So to start us off, I'm going to talk a little bit about planning for the future, how we can maximize and balance your home, school, and community supports, how you can assess your child's readiness for adulthood, and finally, how we can support mental health through the transition from adolescence to adulthood. Next slide. So those of you who are parents already know that time absolutely flies, and the transition years are no exception. Adulthood really will be here before you know it, and it's so important to start preparing now. So I'm assuming that on our call today, we have a range of parents and caregivers who have children of all ages, and we're glad that all of you are here because preparation for this transition to adulthood really should start as early as you can. So learning about this now, if you have children, is helpful, and it's also not too late if your kids are a bit older or already in those transition years. Many important independent life skills can take more time and direct instruction for individuals with autism to master. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to identify your child's strengths and lagging skills early on so that we can help build those skills over time and prepare them for their transition to adulthood. So as you consider these skills, I want you to spend a little bit of time thinking about what you and your child envision for the future. Do you hope that your child might live or work independently? Does your child want to move away from home or go to college? Do you hope that your child might be able to fill their time with enjoyable and productive leisure activities and be an integrated member of their community? All of these goals are important, and they require some degree of independence and skill building. So as early as elementary school, it makes sense for you to start thinking about how you can link your treatment goals to your long-term vision for your child. This will give you the best opportunity for success and allow plenty of time for practice and skill building over the years. Next slide. So how do we do this exactly? Well, we start by building specific goals related to transition into your child's IEP and therapeutic treatment plans. We want to make sure that you're letting your teachers and therapists know what skills are important to you and to your child, and ask them to help you design programming and goals that are going to work towards this future vision and your child's future vision. This might include building some specific goals around things like adaptive skills, including activities of daily living like bathing, dressing, or feeding. It might include functional academic goals where academic concepts are taught within a functional life skills framework. For example, teaching math skills as it relates to money or budgets or recipes. It can also include identifying goals related to things like executive functioning, such as organization, task initiation, and self-monitoring skills. And it may include building some specific college learning or work readiness skills and helping your child to develop effective self-advocacy. All of these kinds of goals are really important, and building them into your IEPs and your treatment plans early on is going to help your child really work in tangible ways towards that future vision. Next slide. Now, as important as all of this is, it's a lot to juggle. So when we start to think about the skills that a child with autism will need as an adult, the list can become long and sometimes can feel overwhelming. And then you add this long list of already existing, you add this long list to the already existing long list of goals that you have for your child's childhood, like social and play skills and their traditional academic learning, and it can feel overwhelming. So although there isn't one right answer, I really want you to start thinking about how you balance the focus on things like traditional academic learning on one hand with the development of functional life skills on the other hand. And use your team of trusted doctors and therapists and teachers to help you think through what goals and skills are most important for your child. In some cases, if you find that your child is stuck on something, consider if it's time to move past that goal and move past that sticking point to another area of learning. For example, I've worked with students who've had the same goals in their IEPs for years and years around rote academics. It might be something like handwriting or printing their name. And when we really step back and assess the situation, sometimes we realize that it may make more sense to let go of that rote goal and move on to something that's more functional and may even be more complex in some ways, like moving towards more functional fine motor goals, like building skills for dressing and bathing. So, constantly reassessing how you're building these goals and whether your child's working on the right things at the right time is important. In some cases, you can see kids with autism who get stuck on something that seems sort of seemingly easy, an easy early milestone, but they actually have great capacity to go on to learn more complex skills with the right support. And so you always want to check in with your team to see if it might be right to sort of mix up your goals or move towards other functional goals if you're feeling that your child's stuck. And I want to walk you through on the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about what this can look like. No child with autism is exactly the same. And so I want to give you paint the picture of 3 different examples of what this might look like. For some students, this might look like a really early and intensive focus on functional life skills. In some instances, you and your team may recognize that your child's needs are significant around self-care and adaptive skills, and you may recognize this very early on. And in this case, I encourage you to be really proactive in making sure that absolutely every IEP and treatment goal is working in service of building functional skills, be it work or for self-care or for leisure. We really want to make sure that those goals from an early age are functional and appropriate. For other students, it's important to continue to build academic skills, particularly meaningful ways that these skills might relate to future work and life tasks, so sort of a functional academic framework. And this could include modified or partially modified academic curriculum, paired with opportunities for real life and hands-on learning in settings like community or vocational settings. And finally, others may recognize early on that their child has ambitious collegiate or learning goals where it makes sense to pursue traditional or advanced academics. But even for those students, it's really critical that we make the time and space to work on building skills around things like executive functioning and self-advocacy. So we're never letting go of this idea that we want to think about the future vision and build goals that will help us get there. Next slide. We'll talk just a little bit today about assessing your child's readiness for adulthood. There are lots of ways that we can assess an individual's readiness for adulthood. And one important step is to complete a formal transition assessment. Sometimes this is a single assessment, and other times it might be a combination of assessments. But we really think about transition assessments as an ongoing process of collecting data that focuses on an individual's needs, preferences, and interests. And you want to work with your team in order to build out a transition assessment that's going to help you understand what goals will be most important for your child. A transition assessment really should be done before a child exits the public school system, and it may need to be updated periodically with new information. For example, at age 14, we might start to think about examining a child's home and living skills and self-care skills. But then by 16 or 18, we really want to dive into evaluating skills for safe community access and participation in activities outside the home, within the community and workplace. Next slide. I want to share just a few concrete tools that can be a helpful component of the transition assessment process. Virginia Commonwealth University, in collaboration with Autism Speaks, has developed a wonderful community-based skills assessment that can help us to identify where an individual's skills are and where they may need to do some skill building to ensure that they're ready for community living. And this tool can be used with children as young as 12 years old, and it evaluates skills across 8 areas of functional life skills, including things like self-determination and self-advocacy, health and safety, peer relationships, community participation, finance, and more. So we'll be sure to include the link to this in our resources that go out to you. Next slide. There are also a number of inventories that can assess and begin to identify areas to build functional living skills. I've listed the information for a few different instruments, including the AFLs here, which looks at areas of functioning such as mobility, community knowledge, shopping, money skills, and other daily living skills. So your team can help you use instruments like that. And then on the next couple slides, I'm going to talk with you just a little bit about psychological and behavioral well-being. So through all of this, transitioning to adulthood can be stressful. It's a time of a lot of changes where individuals are often experiencing a disruption of their familiar support systems, a loss of supportive teachers and pediatric providers. And all of these things place young adults with autism at greater risk for experiencing anxiety and depression. For all of these reasons, I really want to make sure that you as caregivers are prepared to pay attention to issues around mental health and support your child's mental health and well-being. Next slide. So we'll talk just a little bit about how you can monitor your child's mental health. And I want to highlight just a few things that I want you to look out for during these transition years. These things apply beyond the transition years, but are particularly important to watch for during this time of such significant disruption and transition. So you're going to look out for things like changes in sleeping and eating patterns, an increase in repetitive behaviors or stimming behaviors. Sometimes this looks like repetitive question asking or repeated seeking of reassurance. And you can also see things like increased social withdrawal or isolation, a loss of interest in preferred activities, restlessness, tension, or somatic complaints like stomach aches or headaches. Sometimes you can see what appears to be an increase in sort of rigidity or less flexibility. And often this is reflective of an increased desire for control and predictability. So remember, some of these changes can be really subtle when you're living with your child day in and day out, but ask your treatment team to help you monitor for these changes and respond as needed. Next slide. Wrapping things up, I just want to reiterate that by preparing for transition and proactively building some skills and new support systems, you can reduce those symptoms and risks for anxiety and depression. Helping your child to build self-awareness and effective coping skills through their childhood and through their adolescence really sets them up for optimal success in this transition period as well. And if you notice a drop in mood, an increase in depression or sadness or anxiety, consider the impact of what we call behavioral activation. This is sort of the intentional completion of activities throughout the day, and it's a really important added benefit of building a new schedule as you transition into adulthood. When in doubt, connect or reconnect with a trusted therapist. And for the next section of our presentation, I'm actually going to pass the floor to Maddie, who's going to walk us through the next section.
Thank you, Lisa. So when we talk about autism, and we're talking about the actual child or the actual adult, there's different ways that we use language, and some of them you may have heard person first, where we put the person ahead, and we're focusing the person in whatever the condition or the disorder or the disease. You're keeping that separate so that we don't we know that the person is more than that. So my child has autism. But we find that there's a lot of autistics who teens and adults who prefer the concept of identity first. I am autistic because we are born autistic. We do things autistically, the way we think, the way the mannerisms we have. We're born, we live, we die autistic, and we never turn autism off. So there's always a bit of a journey as we work with our kids as they get older and they become more and more aware of themselves and on autism and how they feel or how they identify. So there's also a couple of, if you're uncomfortable with either of these things, there's a way of using a more neutral, a person diagnosed with autism. So we're being factual, or a person that's with the autism spectrum or is on the spectrum. Next slide. Okay, so when we've had this journey of our child in the childhood years, and we've gone through the learning how they all the struggles when they're young, the communication things, the issues with them in school, we've sort of figured them out. Yet the adult years are ahead, and the dynamic that we're going to have changes. My kids, I have 4 autistics. 2 of them are adults, and I have a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old, and they taught me how really things change as they approach the adult ages. So we know that when they're 18, they're an adult. They have legal ability and responsibility for their choices. But we know that, regardless of whether they're autistic or not, they're still learning and changing. The child-based funding that you may have had can end at 18, and finances for family can be stressful. And every autistic adult is going to progress at different paces, and we have different things that are new, that are challenges, employment, school, housing, and all of this can take more time than neurotypical people. So the biggest challenge that in order to support our kids is our attitude and our readiness for a different stage and a different way of relating to them in our parental journey. Next slide. So Lisa touched on some of these things before. These early young adult years are challenging. We have our kids are going from, school is a very structured environment, and we may have worked hard to create some structure in our homes that our children are used to. But when they leave into the more adult worlds, whether they're in school or in work, there's a sort of feel that they need to create their own structure, and that can be very difficult. And what we find is that autistics that have had very minimal support needs in secondary school all of a sudden flounder in college or university or in work settings because they are required to create their own structure, and they've thrived in an environment where it's just been created for them. So mental health challenges suddenly appear with kids that have never had these issues. And we also see a lot of autistics who may have higher support needs. They're yearning for independence. And this can lead to behaviors that we haven't seen because they're trying to act like adults can do. We are all developmentally, we're going to go through the same things and face similar challenges and interests and desires that neurotypical young adults do, but we may not have the necessary understanding to be able to cope with some of these desires. One of the really good things to mention out here, this is why it's really, really good idea that sex education be taught and provided, especially to autistic teens and young adults, in a way that we can understand, to both protect us and to give us an understanding of our own bodies. Next slide. So part of this is, as we're getting older, as autistics are getting older, and we're beginning to understand more about ourselves, it's important to know what autism means. So I get asked a lot by parents, usually with kids that are younger, when should you tell your child they're autistic? And I say always, yesterday. The earlier they know something's different about them. The longer they go without understanding some of the ways it means and putting words to it, the more they can internalize it themselves. And that can create some of these mental health challenges. That can create the sense of difference, the sense of being wrong. And if they're getting bullied, that sort of reinforces all these things. So I find it's really important to, especially as we're getting to these transition years, 16, 17, 18, it's important to explain to them the different diagnoses they may have. Explain to them what it means. And some of the things that you can do is start getting them involved with the IEPs in their schools. Start telling, show them their IEPs, show them the things that where they see their strengths and their challenges, and especially what some of the accommodations that may have been given to them that they may not know of. Because these accommodations, these needs, understanding their needs and being able to put their own words to this is going to be really important as they go through the adult world, where it's going to be very important to ask for accommodations for their needs. Next slide. So we need to teach these autistics in this transition time how to request accommodations, right? And the best way we do that is helping them explain their needs, helping them put words to the things that they're challenged with, as well as put words to the things that they have strengths in, so that they can understand what are the things that have helped them in school or help them at home, and see how they can use those words to be able to ask for them when they're in the adult world, whether they're in school, whether in colleges, whether in work, whether in community programs. And it's also because autism is still there's still a lot of stigma about this. I mean, we're not in a world that's fully accepting of autistics as we are. It's important to help them with only disclosing their diagnosis when they feel comfortable with it and when they're feeling safe with it. Next slide. So when do you share a diagnosis? When does your child, or when do you share a diagnosis as in their transitional or in their adults? It's a very complex question. I mean, I'm 47 and I still have to, like, I'm a very out and proud autistic person. I do that so that I can make it more, I can normalize autism in adults, so that there can be other people that can feel free to share their diagnosis. But I know that even still, as out as I am, it can be. I know there's certain situations where it may not be the right place or the right time. So, you ask, who would it help by sharing to get you the support you need? And there are a few places, any organization, hopefully they have an HR or a trusted person. Hopefully in education, there's disability supports that you can go to and get, talk to them more in detail about your diagnosis, so they can find the right supports, so that you're not having to tell your every professor that you're in what your actual diagnosis is. We're getting closer to a world that's understanding that we need to accept accommodations. So that's a good thing. Accepting diagnosis, we're not there yet, but the accommodations are becoming more and more common. And it's okay to just partially disclose. You disclose some part of you that's a challenge. If you have autism and ADHD, perhaps just disclosing ADHD, which is less stigma in the world. It's okay. It's whatever's comfortable and safe for you. And talking to your team now about all these things will help them prepare themselves for those conversations that they may have as adults. Next slide. So one of my favorite words, and a word that I feel very, very passionate about, is agency. And agency is, it's the capacity, the condition or state of acting or exerting power. All autistics, all humans need to be given, understood that they have agency, and that in the decisions of their lives, that they really should be the either leading it or co-leading that as they get older, so that the decisions are made with them or by them, and not for them without them. And this is a challenge for many parents and clinicians, because for most of the child's life, you're making the decisions. You're fully involved, fighting for them in all places. But as they get older, as they become more mature, as they become more capable, you need to find a way of shifting to be able to, come alongside them. And some people, for some kids, you can go to the next slide. It's challenging. There's a continuum of, from dependent to co-leading to independent, and your child will be different than another person's child. You want to help the children grow where they're at and find the best life for them that they can have, where they can thrive. And it really means looking at where they are, where you are, and how do we find a way to let them start being in the lead. There's going to be some kids that have intense needs, and you're going to be doing more of the leading. And then there's going to be other kids who are just, you're going to be hoping and praying for them, but they're going to lead their lives. And every once in a while, come to you for advice. There's a strong continuum. But you've been with this, you've parented this child so far, and you're coming at a time where your role changes, and it just means a time for reflection and a time for, this is where you're going to grow a lot of gray hair. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Maddie. We're going to talk a little, we're going to talk about everything that we've kind of talked about so far. I'm going to talk a little bit more about community integration, and it's funny when I started to talk about this, a lot of times people will think it's like, it's the accommodations that we make for access into community integration, but it's actually more than that. It's, those accommodations allow that and encourage it and support it, which is fantastic, but it's really about becoming part of the community to be, to successfully work and socialize and play and have fun and create and learn and meet new people. So we're going to talk about it from that perspective rather than the supports that go with it. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I think community integration, I think if you're in those pediatric years, or if you're reflecting back on your pediatric years, I think you'll know a few things, right? It's really easy to become active and involved where your child is active and involved. So school naturally comes into play, but it is a great place where you can, become a volunteer. You can interact with your, the classroom environment, the school environment. You can be on the parent teacher associations. You can be on the school boards. You can do those kinds of things where you can really become active. You can learn about the community, and you can also become a resource of autism. And I think that's one of the things that with community great integration for families like ours is that, not only do we come to participate, but we also bring in a level of knowledge that we can help others learn from, which is autism. So here's just a few suggestions of other places where you can sort of look at that. But this is where we sort of take a very active leading role in community integration. Next slide. So when we think about community integration from those adult years, it's a little bit different. We're not in those school environments where you would naturally be able to, connect and, and volunteer and those kinds of things. It becomes more interest-based. And I think when I reflect back on the case that we talked about earlier, that's where we really need to look at what are those interests, because those are going to be the driving forces of where we're going to start to look for community integration. I loved when the one person on the call said football, like go to some of the, places where they play sports and see if you can volunteer and, be the water person or, keep stats or whatever it might be. And again, I think that that's a really great way to look at it creatively, like how can you make community integration happen? And then as a parent, how can you sort of support it and take a step back? All right, next slide. So I think we demonstrated this with the case today is that, how do you really identify those abilities and interests? And I start with, what are they showing you right now? What are the things they love to do? What are the things they prefer to do? What are those things that come very naturally? What are those things that make them really happy and instill joy, right? And I think as you start to look at those, and I think it's also, you need to take the next step of, like getting some exposure so you can really start to develop the knowledge about abilities and interests, and I think, again, look at where do they want to go? What really motivates them? I think when I think about my son, Henry, I always went to, what is his go-to thing? Like when he has downtime or we're not, actively, on the run to go to, an event or something, what does he like to do? And those were the cues that were giving me interest, like ideas of what his interests were. And I think once you start to do that, then let's start to look at what are some of the opportunities that are locally close to you that you can start to connect with. Again, let's go back to the like sports, football. What are some of those teams? Do you have a professional team in town? Do you have, a smaller team in town? Do you have a local high school that you have connections with? Those kinds of things. But where can you start to develop those opportunities to look for, how do we get into some community integration? All right, next slide. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this so that you can see, like in a pediatric lifetime and in an adult lifetime, like how this can happen. The first one is going to be an artist example, and I'll be really full disclosure here. It's my example with my son, Henry. So, when he was around 3 and between the ages of 3 and 7, it was really a discovery time for us. He loved crayons, he loved paper, he loved markers. I made sure he always had it with him. It was his go-to thing. He loved it. He could occupy himself for, an hour, like just coloring and drawing and whatever it might be. And then as he started to age, we sort of moved into more of a supportive role of this, where I made sure we had lots of supplies, and had a place to store a lot of his art supplies. And, we even started to frame some of his art. I mean, I don't know if Sabrina remembers this, but when we first started to work together, I actually used to bring in some of his little artwork that I would frame, and he was in this age category. But we started to support this interest that he really liked, not knowing where it was going to go, but it was his interest, so we supported it. Then we moved into some exploration where, during a meeting, we mentioned, like, look, he's outgrowing the bins we've given him, and he's outgrowing, the other storage areas. I can't frame any more art in my house. And I mentioned it in a meeting, and someone said, why don't you go tour a studio? It's an old building. It's, it's run down, but they're putting these studios into it, and you might be able to look at it. And I think when we did that, we decided to also take a risk. And the risk was, we're not going to do speech and occupational therapy anymore. And we're going to take that time and that effort, and we're going to move it into renting a studio for a few months and see what happens. So we started to do some exploration. I will say that between the ages of 13 and 14, it became very clear we were not going to probably leave that studio. We've been there for 9 years now. And it's developed into a career for him. He's an emerging artist. He has a professional studio that people come to and he works out of. And I will tell you, back at the age of 3, I never thought that I would probably have this slide in front of me. But I think the thing that's nice is that by looking at what those interests are, supporting them through the timeline, exploring options, talking to people about it, and bringing in creative people to help us think things through, we've really moved him into a community integration environment in the arts. It's been incredible. So let's go to the next slide. Let me give you another example. And this one's the tomato example. And this is about a young adult. She's actually an older woman now, who I've known for I've known the people who support her for a long, long time. She has very limited language. She has some disability issues, but really so mobility is a big issue for her. And the one thing that she loves is tomatoes. Has always loved tomatoes. She will hold tomatoes. She likes to look at tomatoes, books on tomatoes, loves tomatoes. And that is really the only interest that they could ever really determine with her. What they did is they supported her through that. Here's, you can look at the books, you can hold the tomatoes, those kinds of things. And then they started to grow a few tomatoes. They started to do some exploration, and they started to look at some of the farmers markets that were close in their town. And they live in a little town actually out in Colorado. And they started to see, well, how do you grow them? Who buys them? And what's the market for tomatoes in, farmers markets? The thing that came from all of this is that as a team, they said, let's go ahead and do a farmer's market booth and let's have her grow tomatoes. They invested in some hydroponic tomato plant, grow things so that she could access them. They were up off the ground. She could even pick them and put them in baskets and things. And she actually has had a farmer's market booth selling her tomatoes for about 8 years, maybe 10 years now. It's been a really long time. And it's just a wonderful thing, again, where even with, lots of support needs and one love, which is tomatoes, community integration happens. And she actually has a really strong, loyal customer base who buys from her every week. And they're hoping to move her into some small restaurants and things. So again, another example of how you can make community integration happen. All right, next slide. Keeping an eye on time here. Again, I think the thing that's really important is that, when you start to look at those interests and abilities, start to match it with opportunity, right? So, again, talk about interest in meetings, bring creative people into your environment. I always say volunteer as much as you can. Volunteer at festivals and, local events so that you get to learn a little bit more about them. Support fundraisers. It's another way to sort of get into environments that you might be interested in. Arts was one that for us, we started to support a lot of the fundraisers. I think serve on a board. If there's a lot of agencies that need board members and volunteers. And again, if there's an interest area that you or your child has, I think it's a great way to, again, start to get to learn more about your community. All right, next slide. I don't think I think I've kind of said this, but I think, again, with community integration, it's about being seen, being present, being participatory, be a volunteer, be a resource, because as someone who has a direct connection to autism, you have a lot to share, and you can start to help the community around you learn more about autism through your experiences and through your knowledge. So be that voice for not only yourself, for your child, but for other families as you start to move into these areas. Next slide. Next slide. All right. And then, we always talk about teams, right? So this is the child team. This is the pediatric team where we're really leading the teams, and here's all the different people that we interact with. Go to the next slide. But this is what it's really starting to look like when we get into transition. It's about co-leading together. So there's not just one single person really moving this wheel, there's two of us, and Henry's a big part of this. And everything that we're doing is we're trying to build agency in my son Henry with this. And you'll notice a lot of these teams changed. We have social opportunities now. We have health and fitness. We have more mental health issues because anxiety is a part of life now. Employment's a big part of it. Being an autistic voice, and how can we promote that in him? So we're really trying to build agency with him and really keeping him in the lead, and we're supporting him all the way as much as we need to so that he can do a lot of these things independently. And I'll give you a good example. The other day, a lot of the artists will go to this one place to gather on Thursdays. I showed up, Henry was there with everybody that he went with them. I showed up and one of the artists said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm fun too. Can I hang out?" And they're like, "No, this is his space." And it was a hard lesson to learn, but I do need to step away so he has those moments. And even though I want to be involved because it's fun, I have to step away so he has that time. And that can be really hard to do as a family member and as a parent when you've been so actively involved. But sometimes it is a really good thing to do so you can promote that agency in that individual. All right, next slide. And again, I think the thing that we will say too is, transition's difficult. There's not a roadmap. It's going to be very individualized, but those pediatric years are going to end and adult years are going to begin, and what are you doing to put in play that, you're starting a pathway towards transition. You're going to have these team members that are going to go away from like school, and you're going to have new team members from community that'll be a part of your life. And how are you bringing them in and how are you having discussions? But the one thing to remember is that any step in the transition process is a good step. So, pat yourself on the back for what you're doing. And it's not about how fast you transition. It's about that you always are progressing towards it and taking small steps towards change. So, all right. And I think we're at questions now. So Lisa, I'll turn it back over to you.